attention. I'm working on it myself. I also know, like fiscal space, like I said in my book on fiscal space, that cities have solved this problem. Some of them have solved it very painfully, the city of New York or the city of Chicago. We have a lovely Hollywood industry that tells us how this problem was not solved, but how settlements happened and improved. And some have never solved it and declined as a consequence. The city of Washington, until very recently, is a very good example. Or Sao Paulo, the reason you were saying this was the rents issue. When you are in a situation where you cannot tax rents, then typically what I have observed is that what city governments do opportunistically, if they have the political mandate, is engage in boutique taxation or engage in taxation directly related to a problem which is perceived to be a problem in which the political resistance to the imposition of a tax would be limited. An example of boutique taxation is parking fees. Parking fees in this city bear no relationship whatsoever to the income earned by the corporates and the households that own things to park and the places where they go. They can generate a lot of revenue. And in the interim, when you still can't deal with the problem of rents, it's a good idea, I think, to look at these kinds of boutique taxations and dispel perceptions that such taxes cannot be much higher than they are. The second is a very good example of which is congestion charging, which is an example of a tax which is politically sellable, even in the absence of a relatively mature political settlement. And it is something, I think, in India that we have not yet explored. The very fact that we have these inequities and these are causing political mobilizations at the urban level, I think gives us public finance economists an opportunity to see very, very opportunistically whether there are avenues by which we can undertake pro-equity taxation that can also act as a source of revenue to governments. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Roy. Now we'll invite Mr. Anand Sahasranaman.
Thanks, Dr. Ahluwalia and Dr. Mohanty for this opportunity. So I'm just going to restrict my comments to a discussion on some of the themes raised on the metropolitan finance-related chapters in the book, and highlight some of that relevance to the Indian context. I think one of the things that that the book does is sort of highlight this constant tension between funds and functions. This is something that has come up in the discussion already, and it seems like this is a constant underlying problem, not just in India, but in a wider cross-section of countries around the world. One issue that was raised, for instance, is the inadequate revenue tools to meet expenditure requirements. We talked about the case of Punjab. I think Mr. Baijal mentioned it, and the fact that Rajasthan and Haryana state governments have sort of abolished property taxes without consulting with local governments. A related problem is this notion that is the sense that there is responsibilities that are devolved that cities really are in no position to to execute upon. So poverty alleviation, for instance, in India is a function that states have devolved to cities in many cases, and there are no funding mandates, there are no edicts on that, and it's not clear how a city is expected to perform that function. The third, and this is something that's often discussed, is an over-reliance on the intergovernmental system of transfers, which is the SFC mandated devolutions, as well as other program-related devolutions that happen from the center and the state to local governments. And finally, I think one aspect that the chapters do bring out is that not all of these are problems only of the higher tiers of government. There are problems at the local government level itself, and primarily, even in cases where they have the power to do something, for instance, in collecting, they're unable to do so. In fact, the 13th Finance Commission estimates that the collection efficiency of property taxes in India is about 35%. So clearly, these are problems that, while they're obvious in the Indian context, I think that there is a lot of precedence for experience around the world. Now, I just want to turn the discussion a little bit more to financing options, and a little bit around the theme of using financial markets as a source of funding for our cities. So I guess any discussion of finance and financial options for a municipality will have to begin with an understanding of own revenue generation capacity and what they've been able to do in terms of practical implementation. So, and really when you think about internal or own revenue generation, I think one thing that's often argued is that this is a reflection of the quality of governance, the transparency and the accountability of the administration. A better governed municipality, implies better information availability, better assessment capability, and better collection efficiencies. And in a way, you see that reflected in the balance sheet of the city. And when we talk about, what are the levers available to a city to finance itself, in general, we sort of discuss three. One is, of course, the internal levers of taxes and fees. And then there is, of course, the devolved and assigned revenue component. And the third is what, we refer to as market-based financing. So there is a little bit of a distinction between market-based financing and the other two, because market-based financing is really predicated on how a city performs on its own internal revenue generation abilities. So property taxes and user charges, I think it's well recognized that these are very important, levers of cities' finances. And in the absence of predictable, generation of these internal revenues, the option of market-based financing really goes out the window, because ultimately, when you talk about, an instrument like a loan or a bond, it's really an upfront source of funds for payments that you can be that you should be reasonably expected to make over the lifetime of that instrument. In the absence of a proper property tax structure or a user fee structure, or a dependable intergovernmental transfer system, it's very difficult for the market to come in and invest in instruments when there is no clear visibility on how that will be repaid. So while it is an important source, and I think it's something that in the Indian context is extremely critical in view of the extent of infrastructure financing that's required, it's also obvious that unless we get our cities in order, their own financing levers working, this is not something that is really going to come in and solve the problem in a big manner. I think one thing that, one thing that's also relatively obvious is that market-based financing in itself, there's nothing inherently better about it than, state transfers or internal revenue generation. What it, enables is that in the absence of enough funding from these sources, it enables you to reach out and plan better over the long term. And based on, the numbers that Dr. Ahluwalia's committee put out to say that 40 lakh crores of investment is what we need on urban infrastructure, it's very clear that, the intergovernmental transfer system is not going to be able to manage that. So we need to access the markets, which means that we need to be competitive in terms of, the price that you're going to pay, in terms of competing with other, issuers in the capital markets, be it corporate bonds, be it governments for other reasons. And therefore, the city needs to really put its own house, its own finance, its own balance sheet in order. One specific thought that I had when I was also thinking about this was the JNNURM has been a very big source of funding for urban India over the past 8-9 years, and one of the and with the JNNURM 2 coming out very soon, I think one of the issues that at least we've been thinking about a lot is what is it going to do to incentivize greater leverage of private financing with the available funding through this mechanism. There's a more longer term issue in the sense that Indian capital markets themselves are not very well developed, and that it's still largely a bank-led market. So the problem for infrastructure financing is that a lot of infrastructure requires long-term investments. Projects are 15, 20, 25 years long. Bank funding traditionally is can go to a maximum of 7 to 10 years. So unless other investors and the broader capital market develops, this will be a bottleneck in the future, though we are very far from it now, considering that cities have not reached out to the markets in a very big manner. And just to talk a little bit about where we are in terms of our own internal revenue generation capabilities today, the 12th Finance Commission indicated that the total revenue of the Indian municipal sector was 0.67% of GDP, of which own revenues contributed about 0.38%. If you compare this with countries that we like to benchmark ourselves against, say South Africa or Brazil, there's a vast difference. Brazil, for instance, has municipal revenues of about 7.5% of GDP, of which own revenues are about 2.5%. So clearly there is a long way for us to go in terms of our cities improving their own revenue generating capability. Now, on the property tax side, post JNNURM, there's definitely been some improvement we've seen. There's been the implementation of geographic information systems by major cities like Ahmedabad, Bangalore, Hyderabad, who to a large extent have mapped out all the properties in their areas. And the estimation made by the 13th Finance Commission was that if 85% if collection efficiencies were improved to 85%, then property taxes could double to about 0.68% of the GDP. The other issue, and I'm sure that we'll discuss this in greater detail later, is the issue of what are the kinds of assessment mechanisms we use for property taxes. In India, there's a wide range of assessment mechanisms from rental values. Some cities have gone on to area-based and unit area-based values. And clearly there is a sense that we need to move away from our rent control acts and rental-based values. The JNNURM has made a start on this. But when we think about a capital value-based system, there is a more systematic, there's more system-level changes in terms of changes in stamp duties and registration, so that land registries or land transaction registers are actually reflecting real values of land transactions, which is not happening in India today. And finally, moving to intergovernmental transfers, I think this was an idea that that was already discussed in the morning, to say that perhaps there is a need to think of grants in a little bit of a different manner. And I think the Finance Commission again recommended this, to say that there need to be perhaps two types of grants here. One is, of course, a consolidated formula-driven basic grant available to all cities. And a second component that's more performance-based, that gives you an incentive to actually provide the services that you're required to do. So while we have seen some reforms in the area of finance, whether they be in property taxes in Bangalore or some activity on the municipal bond market, I think there is a much greater need for these to be deepened in the Indian context, because in the absence of sustainable financing models, this could seriously jeopardize the creation of inclusive and equitable cities in India. Thanks.
Thank you, Anand. Now we'll take some questions. Yeah.
Now, there is a question and one observation. Question to Professor Pete. If I understood him correctly, I was taken by surprise when he said that after 13th Finance Commission, the ULBs are no longer creatures of a state government. It's not a valid argument. Urban government, urban development, forming part of the state list, they very much continue to be the creatures of the state government, which means that the states create them, the states are supposed to fend for them. Now, another observation is, besides this question, I have not read your book, but you are aware that there is a very long theoretical discussion on metropolitan financing led by a galaxy of economists like Harvey, Bridger, Netzer, Thibault, and all of them have pointed out to center city versus suburb disparities that mark the inefficiency in financing of metropolitan services. So this raises a question, how do we devise, and second related